The Rebbe Zilgazunsan began the Farbrengen this afternoon that this is the Shabbos between Gimel and Yud Beis Tammuz. This Thursday we will be celebrating Yud Beis Tammuz, and this past Tuesday was Gimel Tammuz. And this Shabbos comes between these two inyanim. Firstly, it's the Shabbos, as the Zohar tells us, Shabbos minei mizborch in kulu yomen, that Shabbos gives bracha into the entire week. So therefore, the day of Yud Beis Tammuz as well receives bracha from this Yom HaShabbos from today. On one hand. On the other hand is the day of Gimel Tammuz. And Gimel Tammuz, we know that was the day when the Farbrengen Rebbe was released from prison and he was sent off to exile to the small city of Kostroma. So on this day of Gimel Tammuz, actually the beginning of the Geula, the beginning of the Farbrengen Rebbe's redemption really began already on the day of Gimel Tammuz. Because until then he was simply in a prison cell. So naturally, as explained in Svarim, and as logically could be understood as well, there are various types of imprisonment on a person. There's the worst of it is naturally when one is simply put into a prison cell. An easier way of prison, the Rebbe referred to a house prison. And this is something which the previous Rabbeim had. Previous Rabbeim, that's known for the Tzemach Tzedek and the Farbrengen Rebbe's father, the Rebbe Nishmas Hayden, they were in a house prison. In other words, they were at home, or wherever they were staying.
House arrest.
A house arrest, right. And they were not allowed to leave their home. The Farbrengen Rebbe, when he left the Kostroma, he was limited to be only in the city of Kostroma, to reside there. He had no permission to leave this city. However, it naturally itself understood that this is much easier than him compared being in the prison cell. At that time, when the Rebbe left on Gimel Tammuz to Kostroma, the Rebbe Zilgazunsan added on, really it was unknown what this was leading to. Nobody knew how long he's going to stay in Kostroma. In fact, they thought that it would be something for years, chas v'shalom, and later it turned out something only for a short period of time, from 10 days in Tammuz till 12, 13 days in Tammuz, something like for 9 or 10 days. However, Rabbi Zilgazunsan mentioned when the Farbrengen Rebbe changed, in other words, when he was released from the prison cell and was sent off to Kostroma, though this is also making his imprisonment much easier, at the same token, however, he did not bench goimel yet. When did he bench goimel? When he was considered fully released, that is when he came back from the Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz release, and he was fully released out of prison, that is when he chose to bench goimel, because the chiyuv of goimel obviously was when he was completely freed. This Shabbos today comes after this day of Gimel Tammuz, which in actuality that was the beginning of the redemption of the release of the Farbrengen Rebbe. This is the day that led ultimately to the Geula. This day of Gimel Tammuz we had this week. And it wasn't just a day in the week, it came out to be on Tuesday. And Tuesday is the day, the Yom Shehukfal by Kitayv, the day that Kitayv is mentioned twice in the creation of Tuesday. Now when it comes Shabbos, this day of Gimel Tammuz is elevated on this day of Shabbos. We know Chazal tell us, Misha Torach be'erev Shabbos, yochel b'Shabbos. Who is the one that can eat on Shabbos? The one who prepared his meal before Shabbos. He was Torach be'erev Shabbos, so he has what to eat on Shabbos. And when we refer to Erev Shabbos, it mustn't necessarily mean Friday. It refers to Erev Shabbos. Each and every single day of the week has a shaychus to Shabbos. So Mamela, all in Yonim of the week that has gone by, all really have a shaychus to the Shabbos, to the oncoming Shabbos. So today's Shabbos really has a shaychus to both days. On one end, it has a shaychus to the day of Gimel Tammuz, because Gimel Tammuz was on this past week, and this is all in the week when we were preparing ourselves for this Shabbos, for the forthcoming Shabbos for today. As well, Shabbos, minei mizborch in kulu yomen, Shabbos gives bracha to all days of the week. So therefore, this Shabbos as well has a shaychus to the day of Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, which will fall out in the coming week. And in Shabbos itself, the Rebbe went on to explain, there are also various madregas. There is the madrega Friday night, Shabbos by day, and Shabbos in the afternoon. The highest level in Shabbos itself is the level of Shabbos in the afternoon. And that madrega is called, in the expression of Zohar, it is referred to as Raiva de Raivin. Also, if we want to refer to it, another way of explaining it, these three levels in Shabbos come as a shaykhs to the three others. Friday night is the level of Avraham. Shabbos by day, Shabbos morning, it's the level of Yitzchak. The highest level of Shabbos is Shabbos in the afternoon, and this has a shaykhs to Yankov Avinu. The Gemara tells us, Kol ha'me'anig es HaShabbos, whoever brings oinig, pleasantness into Shabbos, he's zeicha to be blessed with a nachla b'li mitzarim, with an unlimited nachla, with an unlimited inheritance. And the Gemara quotes a pasuk from Yankov. So the Rebbe is explaining, so we see that the Gemara here is talking about which part of Shabbos, about the highest part of Shabbos, about this part of the day that has a shaykhs to Yankov, and that is what part of Shabbos? The part of Shabbos afternoon. The Rebbe's L'Gesunzei was medayik in the expression of the Gemara. The Gemara uses the expression Kol ha'me'anig es HaShabbos. The Gemara doesn't say Kol ha'me'anig es atzmoi b'Shabbos. We know that Shabbos, it's an inyan to have einik, to have pleasantness, to have joy. The Gemara says whoever brings einik into Shabbos. In other words, here the Gemara is teaching us a completely new thing. The Gemara here is teaching us that a Yid is b'koyach to upgrade the level of Shabbos. How great the spiritual level of Shabbos is, a Yid is b'koyach to bring einik into Shabbos. And this is what the Chazal tell us, Kol ha'me'anig es HaShabbos doesn't just simply mean whoever enjoys his own Shabbos and has joy on the Shabbos and has einik pleasantness on the Shabbos. We're talking here about a much deeper madrege. We're talking about a person who's b'koyach to instill this level of einik into the Shabbos. And for the one that lives up to such type of a standard, the Gemara says that he is blessed with a nachal b'li mitzvah. And this is the Shabbos. And Shabbos afternoon particularly, when we're talking about the highest level in Shabbos, and this Shabbos combines these two great inyanim, the day of Gimel Tammuz as well as the day of Yud Beis Tammuz. And the Rebbe concluded that we are to take a lesson of the attitude of the Frierdiker Rebbe, whose attitude was in the format of L'Katchila Ariba. Especially when we look at all the details of type of attitude the Rebbe took throughout all the details of his arrest and when he was investigated and prior to it. So this is an appropriate time for us to really get involved in fulfilling the wish of the Rebbe, and the wish of the Rebbe was to spread Yiddishkeit, bring Yiddishkeit to each and every Yid, and the wells of Hasidus as well, Hafatzas HaMayonis, that it should reach to each and every one of us, and each and every Yid, as the Frierdiker Rebbe himself stresses in the letter which he wrote for the first celebration of Yud Beis Tammuz, that the day of Yud Beis Tammuz has a shaykhs to each and every Yid. It has a shaykhs to those Yidden who fall into the category of Shomerei Torah or Mechavevei Mitzvah. They cherish mitzvahs, love mitzvahs, and observe the Torah. And the Rebbe also adds on, Koil asher b'shem Yisrael yechuneh. Anybody that can be referred to, anyone that only bears the title Jew, has a shaykhs to this day of Yud Beis Tammuz. So it's our union to reach out with the message of Yud Beis Tammuz, to see to it that this reaches to each and every Yid. Because this day, Taka has a shaykhs, it brings geula, brings redemption to each and every Yid, and naturally every member of Klal Yisrael falls into at least one of these categories. Then the Farbrengen, the Rebbe went on and said the Shabbos that could combine Gimel and Yud Beis Tammuz mustn't necessarily be the date of Zayin Tammuz, which is today's date. Could be a different date. We are fortunate that today is the date of Zayin Tammuz. What is so special, or what do we find in the inyan of Zayin Tammuz? So in the Yom of Tilim, which we say today, which this is also a takoneh from the Frierdiker Rebbe, the shiurim of Chitas, And one part of Chitas is that we should recite the Yom of Tilim. As Tilim is divided according to the month, we should say each day the couple of kapitlach that have the Yom that has a shaykhs to this given day. And in fact, it was the year Tafresh Pei Zayin, which was the year when the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest took place. Prior to the arrest, before on the Rosh Hashanah of that year, the Frierdiker Rebbe proclaimed very, very strong and demanded very strong from Hasidim, and not only from Hasidim, from Klal Yisrael, to fill sich with this custom of reciting the Yom Tilim daily. So in today's Yom Tilim, in the Yom Tilim of 7 days in the month, we find the Rebbe expressed himself a very geschmacke inyan. If we look to Kapitel Mem Beis and Kapitel Mem Gimel, both of these kapitlach are in today's Yom. In fact, the last two kapitlach of today's Yom, they both conclude with the same pasuk. Matishtoichachi nafshi o matemi elai, identical, the same pasuk. Kapitel Mem Beis and Kapitel Mem Gimel both conclude with the same exact pasuk. However, in Kapitel Mem Gimel, pasuk Gimel, there's a pasuk that says, Shlach oircha va'amitcha heima yanchuni Yeviuni el ha-kodshecha ve'el mishkanesecha. Ne'im Zmiras Yisrael, David HaMelech, is proclaiming, Shlach oicha va'amitcha. Send your light, and va'amitcha obviously stems from the word emes, sincerity. Heima yanchuni, they will be my guidance. Your oir, Rabbeinu Shalom, your light, and your emes shall serve as my guidance. So immediately the Rebbe explains that the Matish Teichachi Nafshi that we have at the end of Kapitel Mem Gimel obviously is talking on a higher level than the Matish Teichachi Nafshi of Kapitel Mem Beis, because otherwise David HaMelech wouldn't just repeat the same pasuk in one kapitel after the other. Being that here in Kapitel Mem Gimel we are talking after an introduction of Shlach Oicha V'Amitcha, the conclusion of the kapitel, Matishtoichachi nafshi, umatehemi elai, naturally is talking on a higher level. What's the meaning of Shlach oircha va'amitcha? Send your light and your sincerity. So we see what Mefarshei HaTilim explain, other Mefarshim, and we see how Rashi comments. Other Mefarshei HaTilim explain in all different ways. Oircha meaning happiness, va'amitcha also an union of simcha. However, Rashi explains that Shlach Oircha refers to Mashiach. Mashiach is an Indian of Oir. And Amitcha, your sincere one, refers to Eliyahu HaNavi. And as we know, Eliyahu HaNavi and Mashiach, that's an Indian that goes hand in hand. Rabbi explained, why does Rashi have to explain that Amitcha refers to Eliyahu HaNavi? Because Eliyahu HaNavi resembles an Indian of Emes. Though we find Moshe Rabbeinu, the pasuk tells us, B'chol beisi nemanhu. In all my house, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, he's honest, he's most trusted, he's most sincere. So if Moshe Rabbeinu is referred to with a title of a Neman, why, when it comes here in Tehillim, Amitcha, we don't refer this Amitcha to Moshe Rabbeinu, but we rather refer this Amitcha, meaning Eliyahu Navi? The Rebbe explains very pashut, in Pshat. And obviously, if Rashi explains it in Tehillim, it's still the same Rashi whose concept of explaining in Yonim is bound by Pshuta Shel Mikra. And Pashtas HaMikra, Shlach means send us someone new. Send us someone whom we did not have until now. Moshe Rabbeinu, we already had. Though Chazal tell us that regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu now as well, even after his 120 years on this world, Moshe Rabbeinu is in the spiritual world Lamaila, and he's in Oimedu Mishamesh B'Amorim, he's standing and serving B'Amorim Lamaila, and he's also there as a sincere servant to the Rebishter. However, here we are talking in the physical sense. And the physical sense, we are requesting from the Rebishter, send us some sort of a Yeshua which we did not have until now. And if we're looking for some sort of a assistance, major assistance, some sort of source of light and sincerity, which is going to serve as a guidance to us, naturally Rashi can only find, it should mean Mashiach, and it should mean Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Hanavi, the Rebbe added on, is very popular to the child as well. We're talking about Rashi. Rashi's Indian is explaining in Yonim that even a child should understand it. Every child knows of Eliyahu Hanavi's sincerity that today as well, even before the coming of Mashiach, that Eliyahu Hanavi shows up on every bris. And this is something which each and every child knows about. We know that at a bris there's a physical kisei shel Eliyahu Hanavi put down, and when the child raises a question, who is this kisei for? The response comes that this is for Eliyahu Hanavi. So Eliyahu Hanavi, if we're trying to compare Eliyahu Hanavi to Moshe Rabbeinu is taka oimedu mishamesh b'morim. In other words, in the spiritual world, Lamaila, Moshe Rabbeinu is there as well, continuing and serving Klal Yisrael. However, when we are looking for an amitiyus, for someone who can be defined as an emes and an emon on this world, the child feels closer to Eliyahu Hanavi than to Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu is oimedu mishamesh b'morim. However, Eliyahu Hanavi is one whom even now as well we know that Eliyahu Hanavi shows up on each and every bris. So therefore, when we're talking about the pasuk, Shlach Orcha V'Amitcha, which is the pasuk in the capital which is recited on the seventh day of the month on Yom Zayin, Orcha V'Amitcha, it's the Pashut's the Pshat, and this is how Rashi Taka learns that who does the pasuk refer to? It refers to Mashiach and also to Eliyahu Hanavi, and this is what we mean by requesting from the Rebishter, Shlach Orcha V'Amitcha, send us a source of light and a source of sincerity to guide us, meaning the coming of Mashiach and the coming of Eliyahu Hanavi, who will come together with Mashiach. Heima yanichuni, they will guide me. Yeviyuni al harkat shechavel mishkanesecha, they will bring us to Eretz Yisrael. That will be the Giyula. And again, this is something which is very appropriate to be recited on today's day, because today is a day, 7 days in the month of Tammuz, which, as explained previously, this also has a shaykhus to the Geula of the Frierdiker Rebbe, which is also a concept of Geula. This has been a today's date. There's also a very strong shaykhus to Yud Beis Tammuz in this week's parsha. This week's parsha, the name of this week's seder is Parshas Chukas. Chukas simply meaning commandment. We know that mitzvahs are divided into a few categories: edus, chukim, and mishpatim. There are mitzvahs which we have reasons for them, we understand their reasons, and there are mitzvahs which we do not know the reason for it. Even al pi halacha, there is a difference in the two categories. And the Rebbe cited an example from halacha. A mitzvah which we know the reason for the mitzvah, if for whatever reason, let us imagine, this reason is no longer in existence. If the reason is no longer in existence, this leaves room that the mitzvah may also no longer be in existence. However, where there's a mitzvah which we do not know the reason for the mitzvah, for example, a chukah, for example, the mitzvah of parah aduma, which is referred to as a chayk, we have not been told the reason for parah aduma, as the expression of Chazal goes, Gzeira gazarti, chukah chakakti. Rabbeinu Shalom says, this is a law that I have enacted. Ve'ein lecha reshus laharer acher. You are even not permitted to think after this mitzvah. In other words, you have to fulfill this mitzvah without any reasoning, without any understanding. This is what the Rebbe has told us to do. This is what we have to do. Chassidus explains a yet deeper explanation in the concept of chukah. When we want to say engrave in Hebrew, we use the term chukah, lachkoik. Lachkoik means to engrave. What is the difference when something is written or something is engraved? Very simple difference. When we write something, so we take ink, pen, or any other means of writing, and we write on the piece of paper that we're writing on. So the writing and the paper are two separate concepts. However, when something is engraved, so the stone what we are engraving on becomes one with the oisius, with the letters that were engraved on the ois. Same thing the Torah tells us. This week's Sedra begins, Zois Chukas HaTorah. This is the Chukah of Torah, meaning that the association of a Yid and Torah has to be to such an extent like Torah would be engraved on him. Not that a Yid is one thing and Torah is something separate. This week's Sedra teaches us that a Yid and Torah are simply one. Just like when something is engraved, the lettering that have been carved out, engraved on the stone or on marble, become part of the marble or the stone, the very same Torah has to be with the Yid who has a shaykhus to Torah. Zeis Chukas HaTorah. Torah is a chukah, is engraved within each and every Yid.
Chukah means engraved?
Yes. Therefore, incidentally, the Rebbe also explained, this raises a question. We know that the luchos, the first luchos which were given by the Rebishter, the engraving was done by the Rebishter himself. That's what Chazal tell us. Then when Moshe Rabbeinu came down on Har Sinai and found that the Yidden have worshipped to the Yegel, Moshe was so angry that he dropped the luchos. To such an extent that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him, Yasher koyach sheshibartam. The Rebishter thanked him for breaking the luchos. Rebbe asked, what's the... Something very not understood. We're talking by a creation done by the Rebishter. Moshe went ahead and broke this. And the Rebishter should have been very unsatisfied with Moshe's attitude. What do we find? Chazal tell us that the Rebishter commended him, he thanked him for it, he thanked him for breaking the luchos. Something very strange. However, the Rebbe explained, Chazal tell us that when Moshe broke the luchos, the letters within the luchos, the letters flew away. So actually the engraving part, which were the letters, this like flew away. What was left that broke? It was only the simple rocks that did not have any lettering on them. However, the Rebbe concluded this is still something which requires some sort of an explanation, interpretation. How can the Rebbe himself go ahead and thank Moshe Rabbeinu for breaking something which was Maaseh Hashem, which was created by the Rebbe? Again, but what we do derive from this, what the whole attitude of a Yid towards Torah has to be in a format of chuk. In the details of the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest, we find the Rebbe related today that when they changed initially, when they had the Frierdiker Rebbe arrested, they wanted chas v'shalom achas dosam. What they wanted to do was, God forbid, to kill the Frierdiker Rebbe. Later, through all types of influence which reached the Russian government of that time, they changed the Frierdiker Rebbe's decree, and rather than chas v'shalom killing him, they wanted that he should be sent off to far Siberia for a 10-day period. 10-year period, thank you. Later, this was changed to a 3-year period. And not only not to a far north where the weather is horrible, but they changed it around it to the city of Kostroma.
It's very hot.
I don't know. But it seems like the weather there is not as bad as it would be in far off Siberia.
Where's Kostroma?
City in Russia, I don't know. So, when they came to tell the Frierdiker Rebbe that he will be released from his prison cell and that he will have to travel to Kostroma, so the Rebbe asked if this was on a Thursday. The Rebbe added, Rebbe soll gesund sein, added, he doesn't know whether this was on a Thursday morning, a Thursday afternoon, a Thursday evening. All he knows is that this was on a Thursday. And that is when they told the Rebbe that he has to go out of the prison cell and go off to Kostroma. So the Rebbe asked, when will I arrive in Kostroma? So they told the Rebbe that he will arrive on Shabbos to Kostroma. The Rebbe's initial reaction was, if I will arrive on Shabbos, then I am not going. The Rebbe raised the question this afternoon. We know very well that there is an inyan of pikuach nefesh. When it's a question of saving one's life, even if it involves traveling on Shabbos, naturally it is permitted. The Frierdiker Rebbe knew very well who he was dealing with. And those people, the life of a person, did not have too much meaning to them. And especially in light of the fact that they had already decreed, they had already planned that they would chas v'chalila kill the Rebbe. And it was changed. Now that the Rebbe is not cooperating with them, the Rebbe very well knew what could have understood and imagined to what this may lead. Because we know very well, when it comes the moment that they tell somebody that this is the second that he has to leave the prison cell, so they don't want him to stay an extra minute as well. So therefore, they naturally wanted very much, they had the fullest intention that the Rebbe must leave at that minute. And here the Rebbe goes ahead and takes a chance and puts himself into sakana and says, no, I will not go if this would mean for me to travel on Shabbos. Furthermore, the Rebbe had many alternatives. The Rebbe could have left the prison cell on the Thursday, and before going on the train, to beg and ask, let me stay home, or let me stay with my family, or let me stay anywhere for another day or two over Shabbos, and I'll go after Shabbos. But at least to show them some sort of satisfaction that he's cooperating with them, and when they tell him to leave the prison cell, he should leave. He didn't do it. Furthermore, the Rebbe listens and asks, what he should have done was, he should have gone on the train, and perhaps he could have begged mercy from the conductor on the train. Maybe he would stop the train, and by that way, he would work out not to travel on Shabbos. Or even furthermore, traveling on Shabbos on such type of condition would only involve an Issa Darabon. An Issa Minat Torah, it definitely would not involve. And the Rebbe explained it for many reasons. First of all, he already got onto the train before Shabbos. And the train did not require any type of Isser Melacha from the Frierdiker Rebbe to get involved in the operation of the train. So at the most, it could have been an Issa Darabon. It was, the train was traveling Lamayla Ma'asara, higher than 10 Tvachim, which is also getting involved in the dinim of Rishuyas. It's also in the dinim of Rishusn of Shabbos. It also can be reflected mostly as an Issa Darabon and not more than that. So why is it that the Frierdiker Rebbe resented so and turned down fully when he was offered to leave the prison cell on a Thursday and go ahead to leave immediately to Kostroma? He took a very firm stand and he said he will not do it. The answer to it, the Rebbe says, we find in this week's Chazarah. And very particularly in the Parsha of this week that has a Shaykhs to Tuesday. We know again that it was the wish of the Frierdiker Rebbe, as Shiurim of Chitas, that each Seder is divided into 7 parts. And every day of the week to learn the Parsha of that day, Sunday to learn till Sheni, Monday from Sheni till Shlishi, and so on, and by the end of the week to complete the Seder on Shabbos. In this week's Seder, in Tuesday's Parsha, it is discussed in detail the story with the Mei Meriva, when the Yidden had to have what to drink in the Midbar, and Moshe Rabbeinu was told by the Rebishter, Kachas hamata, take the stick, Hakil Sa'eda, gather, congregate all of Klal Yisrael, Ata v'Aaron Achicha, v'dibartem el asela leineim, talk to the stone, to the rock, and the rock shall give water. We recall the Psukim. What happened was, Moshe Rabbeinu sinned. Rather than talking to the stone, he hit the stone. And then Hashem Yisbarach expressed himself, Vayemer Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron, Yan lo yamantem bi, lahaktisheni le'inei b'nei Yisrael, because you did not believe in me to sanctify my name in the eyes of Klal Yisrael, lochen lo yisaviu es hakol hazeh la'aretz asher nasati lahem. That is why the Rebishter says, Moshe Rabbeinu will not be the one that will lead the Yidden into Klal Yisrael. That is in Pasuk Yud Beis, at the very end of the Parsha, right before Revi, one Pasuk before Revi. Actually, the Rebbe says, what really happened here? Previously, Moshe Rabbeinu had already experienced hitting the stone, and it worked. The Rebishter here as well told him, Kachas hamata, take the stone, take the stick rather. Take the stick with you. So immediately this gave Moshe Rabbeinu some sort of an indication that there may be a need to use the stick. Still at the same time, the Rebishter is punishing Moshe Rabbeinu and telling him he will not be zeicha to go into Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because he wasn't Mekadesh Shem Hashem. The Rebishter told him to talk to the stone, and what he did was he hit the stone. Was Moshe really that wrong? He wasn't, the Rebbe is explaining. Because obviously, the Rebishter also gave an indication for him to take along the matter, to take along the stick. However, what really happened here was, Moshe Rabbeinu was not Mekadesh Hashem. He had an opportunity to be Mekadesh Hashem, to sanctify Hashem's name, and this would be proven by the fact Moshe should only speak to the stone, to the rock, and the rock would respond by giving water, and Moshe did not do it. In other words, halachically, into halachic details, we can't find any wrongdoing by the act of Moshe Rabbeinu. However, if we're looking, when one has an opportunity to sanctify HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, and he doesn't do it, this was what really went wrong by Moshe here. The Rebbe says he doesn't want to get involved in discussing the wrongs of Moshe Rabbeinu. He doesn't want to elaborate on discussing a wrongdoing of Moshe Rabbeinu. However, as we gather from the Psukim, this is what Moshe should have done, and he did not do it. The very same is the attitude of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe, halachically, could have definitely left prison on Thursday and gone onto the train and travel and arrive in Kostroma on Shabbos. And al pi halacha, there wouldn't have been no Isra. However, when we're talking from a different concept, when we're looking at it from terms of Kiddush Hashem, it definitely would not have been a Kiddush Hashem. That a person like the Frierdiker Rebbe, in those days, would travel on a train. True, he's doing it to save his life, no question about it. And if there's no Isra D'Oraisa involved, it's only an Isra D'Rabbanan, as we just explained. There are many halachic ways which he could have circumvented, and it would have been perfect for him to travel on Shabbos. However, a Kiddush Hashem it wouldn't be. And that is why the Frierdiker Rebbe refrained from it. On such a time, in those days in Russia, when Yiddishkeit was being so in sakone, and so in danger, and the Frierdiker Rebbe had a chance of doing an act, whether it would be a Kiddush Hashem, or Chas v'Chalila, the opposite of a Kiddush Hashem, naturally the Rebbe chose to do something which is a complete Kiddush Hashem, and therefore he rather put his life into danger and refused leaving on Thursday the prison cell, sat in prison till after Shabbos, and then it was on Sunday, Gimel Tammuz, that year it fell out on a Sunday, when the Frierdiker Rebbe left the Kostroma. Why? Because it was a question of Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the Rebbe's name. And a question of Kiddush Hashem, this comes far and above anything. And that is why the Rebbe Taka did not travel on Shabbos, or did not take any chances in various ways which he could have done, and preferred not cooperating with the KGB, and rather stood in Russia in the prison cell over Shabbos, and it was later that he left the Kostroma. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe, as usual, referred to a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, as well as a Rashi in this week's Sedre, also commentary on the Zohar from his father, L'Kutei Levi Yitzchak. Let us go first to the Mishnah. Today's Pirkei Avos this afternoon we recited Perek Hamishi. Perek Hamishi, there's a Mishnah which tells us, it's the latter part of Mishnah Dalet. Asara nisyonos nisu aviseinu es HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'midbar. There were 10 tests which our ancestors in Nisayon tested the Rebishter. Shenema vayinasu oisi zeh esa pa'amim. Hashem says, they have already tested me 10 times, v'leishamu b'koili, and they have not listened to my voice. Actually, if we look through Perek Hamishi begins discussing the greatness of number 10. And then the Tanoim find numerous things, many things, which number 10 is outstanding with. One of them is this inyan, that there were 10 nisyonos, 10 tests made in the Midbar, and the Tana goes ahead and quotes a pasuk. So from this pasuk, we already see that there were 10 nisyonos. What is the conclusion of the pasuk? The Yidden did not listen to me. We know, the Rebbe Zalman asks, the Torah is very careful in discussing something which does not bring pride and honor to Yidden. Torah is extremely careful. There's a Chazal which tells us at length how the Torah is very careful about it. Here the Tan of the Mishnah wants to bring a raya that there were 10 nisyonos in the Midbar. Fine. Quote the pasuk. Vayinasu oisi zeh esa pamim. Why is there a need to quote the latter part of the pasuk? V'leishamu b'koili. V'leishamu b'koili does not give us any deeper understanding in the fact that there were 10 nisyonos. At the most, we will say that the Tana does not want to quote a half a pasuk. Let him go ahead and say Vayinasu oisi zeh esa pamim v'daima. As we know, whenever we quote a pasuk and we do not quote the entire pasuk, we are merames with the word v'goyma. Enough. Why does the Tana have to say v'lo shamu b'koili? This is something which obviously does not bring too much pride to Yidden, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying that the Yidden in the midbar did not listen to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Also the Rebbe is asking, if we look through the Perek, the Mishnahs here discuss the greatness of number 10, greatness of number 4, and greatness of number 7. In Yonim that are involved with 7. How about number 5? Number 5 is a very chashiva mispa, a very chashiva number in Torah as well. Furthermore, there's another number. There's a number 13, which is also a very outstanding number by Yidden. The Rebbe says there's a medrash, a complete perek in a medrash, which is set aside to discuss the greatness of number 13. And that medrash mentions many inyanim that have a shaykhis to number 13. So obviously the whole concept of Perek Chamishi here is to discuss inyanim that have a shaykhis to certain numbers. Why does he bypass number 13 and doesn't mention anything about it? On this second question, the Rebbe did not answer in this afternoon's Farbrengen. However, Benegei, the first question, the Rebbe is explaining as follows. What the pasuk says, "V'lo yishamu b'koili," the Rebbe is teaching, mustn't necessarily mean that the Yidden did not listen in the voice of Hashem to the extent that they physically did not do what Hashem wanted them to do. Shmiya, shamu, means havana, means understanding. It means that the Yidden did not agree to in the high level, their havana v'hasaga, their understanding was not to go along and do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted them to do. However, physically, l'maisa, they did what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted them. And the Rebbe cites a Rambam. Rambam tells us that when a Yid is forced to do a mitzvah, famous Rambam, though he's physically forced, and we see that the Yid really does not show any desire to fulfill the mitzvah, we credit the Yid fully, and it is considered as if he had done the mitzvah willingly. Why? Because really and truly, each and every Yid wants to perform every mitzvah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The inner will of a Yid is to perform the mitzvah of Hashem. However, unfortunately, there are certain limitations and certain kind of side effects that at times a Yid does not fulfill the mitzvah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when we're talking here, Vayinasu oisizeh esapamim, v'lo yishamu b'koili, they have tested me 10 times. V'lo yishamu b'koili, they have not listened to me. It's not meant in the sense that they have not fulfilled in Maaseh the mitzvahs which they were required to do. It means al derech, like when one is forced to do a mitzvah and he does it, he's still credited for doing the mitzvah. The same applies here, v'lo yishamu b'koili, meaning that in terms of Havana v'Asag, in terms of their understanding, their agreement to the mitzvah, there it was lacking. However, physically they went along fulfilling the mitzvahs of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Rebbe explained the whole concept of a nisoyin, the whole concept of a test. What's the pshat? We test. We test Hashem. When does one test Hashem? One tests Hashem when he's not fully attached to the Rebishter. Because if we would be fully attached to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then there's no need for a nisoyin. A test applies, an Indian of Nisayin applies when one is a Pesach al Shtei Asifim. He's dancing on both sides. In other words, he's undecided whether to stick to the Rebishter Chas v'Shalom Fakert. That is when there's an Indian of Nisayin, he goes ahead and he does certain type of actions. He wants to test Hashem. However, Nisayin has a deeper explanation as well. Chassidus teaches Nisayin stems from a word uplifting, Orim Nisi. Meaning, after one goes through Nisyainais, he becomes uplifted as well. In other words, when we test the Rebishter, and naturally the results of the test are for us to remain close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, here from the Nisayin comes the outcome of it, that it's an elevation, it's a spiritual elevation, it's an inyan of a Nisayin being elevated to a higher madrege. However, now back to the Mishnah. Mishnah here is talking about Asara Nisyonis that Nisu Aveseinos HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bamidbar Shenema Vayinasu Oisi Zeh Esapamim V'Leishamu B'Koili. It cannot be said that the Mishnah is saying Ignai on Yidden, something which is not becovered, something which is not honorable to Yidden, that the Yidden did not listen to the voice of Hashem. This is not so. V'Leishamu B'Koili here means the mere fact that they got involved in Nisyonis. This in itself shows that they were lacking close association to the Rebishter. So therefore, their Havana V'Asaga, their full giveaway to the Rebishter was lacking. True, when we learn it in Chumash, the Yidden were taka punished for it, because that's not the way it should be. However, at the same time, it does not mean that the Yidden did not fulfill the mitzvahs which HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted them to fulfill. This is not the pshat in the Mishnah. Mishnah only says, meaning it was the lack of the Havana V'Asage, lack of giveaway, lack of understanding for godliness for the Rebishter. But it does not mean that there was a lack in fulfilling of the mitzvahs. We will go to the Rashi in this week's Seder. It is Kapitel Chav Aleph, Pasuk Chav Gimel. Torah here discusses how the Yidden were wandering in the Midbar and were trying to get into Eretz Yisrael. And the Torah says, "V'loy nosan sichain es Yisrael aver b'gvuloi." That sichain did not allow that the Yidden should be able to go through his gvul. V'yesef sichain es kol amai, his border. He didn't let the Yidden enter his territory. And sichain gathered his entire nation. V'yetze lekras Yisrael hamidbar. And he went out to the Yidden into the midbar, and he got involved in a battle with the Yidden. Second Rashi on the pasuk. Actually, let us look through the first Rashi. It'll also be negeya. Why did Sichon not allow that the Yidden should go through his country? So Rashi tells us, "Shekol malchei Canaan hoyu malam loy mas." All the kings of Canaan paid a tax to Sichon, that Sichon should protect them from the Yidden. She'lo yavru aleim gaisos, that any types of troops should not go through their country. In other words, obviously, we see right away that Sichon was the strongest of amongst the Malchei Canaan, and therefore they all paid him a tax, a certain type of a tax. He should serve as their protector. As soon as the Yidden suggested that they want to pass his country, my whole existence here is to watch all the goyim, that you people shouldn't come through here. Now you want to cross my boundary, you want to go on my territory, how can I let you do that? Therefore, he went out towards the Yidden. Obviously, this gives us an understanding why Sichon was more concerned than any more of the goyim. Because if we look through the psukim, there were other nations here as well. There was Ammon, there was Moav. None of them felt so concerned about the Yidden not passing their territory as much as Sichon did. Why did Sichon Melech HaAmori feel more than anyone else? So Rashi right away gives us the reason for it. Because Sichon was simply paid for doing this job. And the emissaries, Rabbi explains that if we remember the Rashi in Shlach tells us that there are certain countries, there are certain areas which produce stronger people. And yesh eretz megadelas, such type of people. We're talking here about Sichon Melech HaAmori. So we must say that Sichon himself was physically very strong. The Amorim were a strong nation. And that is why Sichon and his nation were the ones that were chosen by the surrounding nations to serve as protectors. Then Rashi goes ahead, Vayetze Likras Yisrael. Rashi comments, Ilu haisa Cheshboin Melei Yatushim, if the city of Cheshboin would be full of insects, Ein Kol Berye Yechoyle Lakavsha, nobody would be able to conquer it. In other words, it was such a strong city that even if it would be only full of insects, the Yidden wouldn't be able to conquer it. And if Sichon wouldn't have been the ruler of the Amorim, but he would be a ruler of a very weak village, nobody would be able to conquer him. Again, because of the strength that Sichon possessed. Kolshkein, Ilu Haya Becheshbon. Kolshkein, if Sichon would be in his capital of Cheshbon, it would put together two very strong factors: a very strong city and a very strong ruler, a very strong general. Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu, so the Rebbe said, why should I burden my children so much? Lotzur al kol ir v'ir, to go ahead and have to surround each and every city. Nasam b'leif kol anshe ha'malchama, he gave into the heart of all their leading people, leading war generals, lotzis min ha'yoris, to go out of the cities. V'niskaptzu kulam l'mokem echad, and they all gathered on one spot. V'sham naflu, and that is where they all fell. So the Rebbe made the job much easier on Klal Yisrael. Misham, and from there, Holchu Yisrael, that is where the Yidden went, Ela Arim, into each and every city. Ve'ein Eimid Lenegdam, and there was no one in their interference. Ke'ein Sham Ish, Ela Noshem V'taf, because there was no one left there. All the men went to join in the Milchama. They were all killed. Who was left in the cities? Women and children. So the Yidden didn't have no problem to get into each and every city. Rabbi is asking, this Rashi is contradictory from beginning to the end. Here, the opening words of Rashi is that if any of these, if Cheshbon would be even full of insects, the Yidden wouldn't be able to conquer Cheshbon. Then Rashi concludes that all the men were out. Who was left? Only Noshim V'taf, women and children. And that is why it was easy for the Yidden to get into the cities. Rashi just told us a minute ago that it was impossible for the Yidden. Why? Because of the Yatushim. Even if there would be only mosquitoes, the Yidden wouldn't be able to get in. So how is it that they were able to come to Noshim V'taf? Noshim V'taf are still stronger than the mosquitoes. Rab is explaining, and he's noting something else. If we look into this Pasuk Chav Gimel, actually there are two Rashis. There's one Rashi that begins with the words V'loi Nosan Sichon. The second Rashi begins with the words Vayetze Lekras Yisrael. Actually, the Rebbe says he would want to say that it is really one Rashi, one long Rashi, because it's all one long interpretation. How Sichon protected the Yidden, protected the Goyim against the Yidden. I'm sorry. The only thing is, Vayetze Lekras Yisrael is a quote of the pasuk, but really it's part of the Pirush. Let us look in for a minute. Being that Sichon was so concerned protecting the Goyim, that is why Vayetze Lekras Yisrael. What he also did was he went out Lekras Yisrael. In other words, these words Vayetze Lekras Yisrael should not be in a special lettering as the beginning of a new Rashi. These words Vayetze Lekras Yisrael are really part of Rashi's Pirush. That is why, in other words, Rashi is concluding his Pirush. That is why, being that Sichon was so concerned, they were all malim mas, they were all paying him taxes to serve as their protector. That is why he went out Lekras Yisrael. And that is why also Sichon went out Lekras Yisrael, and he did not wait for the Yidden to come to Cheshbon. He did not wait for the Yidden to come into his capital, and when the Yidden will reach his territory, that is when he will start up with them. He didn't wait for that. Even prior to that, Sichon took an interest to go ahead and see to it to prevent the Yidden from entering Eretz Yisrael, because this was Sichon's entire image at that time. That is what all the surrounding Goyim paid him for, that he should do such type of a job. What is a yatush? A yatush is a mosquito. A mosquito, if Cheshbon would have been full of mosquitoes, then it would have been very hard for the Yidden to conquer Cheshbon. Why? Even if all the males would leave, and they would all go with Sichon the king into the Milchama, and Sichon, and they all left the cities. This is the nest which HaKadosh Baruch Hu did. And even if the Rebbe would leave in Sichon only the mosquitoes, Rebbe explains, we know very well that mosquitoes at times could also cause many, many problems. And we know in certain weathers, for example, we suffer badly from mosquitoes. So even if the Yidden would be successful and not having to deal with any adults. But there would only be mosquitoes in Cheshbon. It also would have made it hard for the Yidden to conquer Cheshbon. First of all, Cheshbon was surrounded with a wall. Should the Yidden be successful to climb up to the wall and be able to go over the wall, and by doing such type of an act, breaking the wall and being able to conquer Cheshbon, the mosquitoes are powerful enough to fly as high as the wall of Cheshbon is, and for all those who are trying to climb over the wall, all the mosquitoes would be able to gang on these people and would make life miserable for them and constantly keep on biting the people, and therefore it would be impossible to get into Cheshbon. So when Rashi says, Ilu hoisa Cheshbon meleya yatushin, if Cheshbon would be full of mosquitoes, ein kol berya yechayla lekafsha, it means takazoi. Why? Because yatushin are something that can hold back kol berya, any type of people, from conquering a city. Because yatushin possess something within them that can hold back people. They could make it so miserable for people that people wouldn't be able to move and go ahead and conquer the city. And if Sichon would be ruling a weak village, no. Here Rashi doesn't use the word berya. Here Rashi uses the word person. And again, every word in Rashi is extremely accurate. Still, nobody would be able to have Mulchama with Sichon, because Sichon is extremely powerful. What did the Rebishter do? The Rebishter made a nest. The nest was that all the male were instructed by their army generals to leave the cities and to go out and have Mulchama with the Yidden. And on this one spot, the Rebishter performed the nest, and that is where they all fell. And therefore, it was easy for the Yidden to go into the cities, because all that was left in the cities were Noshim V'taf, women and children. And with the women and children, the Yidden were able to work their way around and were able to take over all the cities. So in the emes, what we gain is that both of these Rashis are really one Rashi. And the words Vayetze Lekras Yisrael should not be a beginning of a Rashi. These words Vayetze Lekras Yisrael come as part of the Pirush of the act of Sichon. What Sichon did, he was a Yetze Lekras Yisrael. This was another act which he was mechuyev to do. Just that the one who composed the Rashis, the printer, he saw the words Vayetze Lekras Yisrael, and he knows that these are words from the pasuk, he turned it into a separate Rashi. And we gain a different understanding now. Obviously, we learn that if Cheshbon would be full of insects, it's very easy. Full of mosquitoes, it's very easy to conquer it. And therefore, our question is, Noshim V'taf is harder. It's not so. Yatushim are harder. And when the city is full of mosquitoes, it would be very hard to work our way around that city. But the Rebishter actually did not put mosquitoes there. There were no mosquitoes in Sichon. The men left. In other words, the strong people of Sichon, what Sichon produced, they all left the city. All that was left in the city was Noshim V'taf, and therefore the Yidden were able to come in. But again, the Zohar in this week's Sedra, Rabbi quoted a Zohar which discusses how every Yid possesses within him the midah of din and the midah of rachmim. Rabbi asked, this is something which we do not need the Zohar to tell us, it's something which is very known. We know that a person possesses within him a feeling of rachmanis, a feeling of pity. And we know on one hand, on the other hand, that there are people that at certain times they exercise an action which is contrary to pity, an action of strength, an action of gvura. And this is something which is full all over in Chazal, that there are certain times we have to apply an act of gvura, and there are times we have to apply an act of chesed, an act of rachmanis. So the Rebbe is learning pshat that what the Zohar is meaning, what the Zohar here introduces, that at the same time we may be forced at certain situations to combine gevura and chesed together. And the Rebbe cited examples by Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, who is known to be the father of chesed. Avraham Avinu fed everybody and had a house with 4 doors, a door on each side, and was all bypasses, all wanderers. Everybody was able to enjoy meals at Avraham Avinu. At the same time, we find that Chazal tell us that when the people wanted to thank Avraham Avinu for their meal, Avraham Avinu's reaction was, don't thank me, thank the Rebbeinu Shalom. Chazal used the expression when they refused, if they would refuse, Hischil Meitzar Lahem. Avram Avinu would be them Meitzar. The Rebbe teaches in Yiddish, will say the gang in the young. He would make life miserable for them. In other words, on one hand, Avram Avinu was extremely kind, expressed an act of chesed, served people. On the other hand, when this same person who just performed an act of chesed, when they refused to fulfill his wish, which was to thank the Rabbeinu Shalom for the food, Avram Avinu was simultaneously able to exercise an act of gevurah. Same thing we find by a bezdin, a Jewish bezdin, a Jewish court. The whole idea of a bezdin is to bring din, to paskin halachas as it should be accordingly. In other words, when a bezdin has a case in front of him, bezdin is not allowed to take pity into consideration. Concept of pity does not exist. Bezdin has to take and evaluate and look at the rights and the wrongs of all the people involved, and that is how bezdin is supposed to issue the verdict. However, at the same time, we find that Chazal keep on stressing v'shaftu ha'eda v'hitzilu ha'eda. Mar tells us on the pasuk v'shaftu ha'eda that talks about bezdin serving as judges. At the same time, the Torah instructs them that they have to have a concept of hatzalah in mind, a concept of rescue in mind as well. Though on one hand what they're doing is exercising an inyan of mishpat, they're exercising gvura, din iu mishpat. At the same time, what they have to do is keep in mind, I can't recall if the Rebbe mentioned it today, but at many occasions he does. There's a Gemara, the Gemara tells us that a bezdin, a Jewish court, that would issue a verdict of killing a person once in 7 years, or there's another girsa once in 70 years. A Jewish court who was active on a day-to-day basis. And if once in 70 years he would go ahead and issue to kill one person, this bezdin is called a bezdin katlanis, a bezdin that kills too frequent. So we see that when bezdin was judging in Yanim, the concept of chesed had to be involved, that they always had to have some, behind their minds, and back of their mind, they always had to have in mind how they could rescue the person as well. So again we see how chesed and gevurah can be united in the same act, in the same action. This is what the Gemara says. The Gemara tells us that a person's attitude has to be Yimim mikareves v'smoil deicha. The right hand, we have to bring the person close. However, at the same time, we have to have a power of smoil deicha with our left hand to push off the person. The mother says this applies b'negei educating a child. In other words, when parents raise a child, they have to have kiruv, warmth to the child, and at the same time, there's a feeling of firmness which also has to be exercised by raising the child. Otherwise, the child will not be raised up properly. However, the Rebbe stressed today, we know every word in Chazal is accurate, extremely accurate. Chazal tell us the right hand is the one that has to be used for kiruv, and the left hand is the one that has to be used for richuk. What is the difference between the right and the left? Very simple. We find in the parsha of Tefillin, where the Torah tells us that Tefillin have to be put on our hand, Yotcha, so Chazal darshan, Yat Keho, the weaker hand. The weaker hand is the left hand. In other words, Chazal tell us when we have to exercise an emotion of kiruv, an emotion of richuk, it's the emotion of kiruv that has to be done with the right hand, with the stronger hand. It's the feeling of richuk that has to be done with the weaker hand. In other words, true, we have to exercise gevurah and strictness to bring up a child. Otherwise, it wouldn't work out properly. However, we have to know that this has to be the weaker method. It has to be taka used. It has to be there. It must be in existence, but it has to be weaker. In comparison to the yemin mikareves, the smoil deicha has to be in a much weaker manner. Same the Rebbe says when we go at our mifzoim, and we introduce Yidden to certain mitzvahs. And at times we are successful to introduce a Yidden to one mitzvah, to two mitzvahs, or at times we are successful to introduce them to all of the 10 mitzvahs. However, at the same time, which this is a concept of kiruv, we're bringing a Yid closer to the Rebbe, an inyan of Yimim Kareves. At the same time, we have to tell the person whom we are dealing with, that by doing this 1 or 2 mitzvahs, or even 10 mitzvahs, he's yet not fulfilling all of Taryag mitzvahs. Torah calls for much more. In other words, there's no meaning of leniency, being lenient and telling him that if he would do all the 10 mitzvahs, this already means that he's an observing Jew. It is not so. These are major mitzvahs, and these are mitzvahs that come as an introduction that will ultimately lead for him to fulfill all the mitzvahs. However, we cannot fool ourselves or fool the person whom we are introducing to Yiddishkeit and telling him there's only an yemim mikareves, there's only an inyan of kiruv, there's only an inyan of rachamim, and this is it, and there's no more to it. On the contrary, this is what we begin with, and the rest will come. During the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also mentioned that there are some individuals here who are here at today's Farbrengen and will not be here at the Beis Tammuz Dike Farbrengen. They will be traveling to other countries. And the Rebbe called them and gave them mashke from today's Farbrengen. They should be able to take it along with them, and wherever they will be at Beis Tammuz, in the Farbrengens that will be made in the Beis Tammuz, in their geographic location, they will become part of us. Huh? Okay, they will become part of us at today. They will, through the mashke, which is a gashmiistic thing, which is being given from today's Farbrengen, being given to other cities and other countries. This will mean that the people there who will receive the mashke and Yud Beis Tammuz will become united with us with today's Farbrengen here. Towards the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe again reminded that being that we are numerous days before Yud Beis Tammuz, it is again an opportune time to remind that all the preparations that have to be done for Yud Beis Tammuz and the entire message which Yud Beis Tammuz brings with it, as discussed early in the Farbrengen, it's a message to each and every Yid, as the Rebbe keeps on stressing, to everyone, Koila Sheb'Shem Yisrael, Yechuna, as the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, for anyone who can only be who's merely identified as a Yid, he has no other qualifications within him. In other words, Yiddishkeit is something at the time even secondary to him. He only has Yiddishkeit as a kinui, as a nickname. In other words, it's something which is not his main thing. Still, Yud Beis Tammuz has a shaykhus to each and every Yid, and we now are the days for us to prepare ourselves to Yud Beis Tammuz, to bring the message of Yud Beis Tammuz to each and every Yid, and as the Rebbe concluded, b'simcha of v'tuv lavav. This should be done with great joy and with happy feelings. Happy Tavach.